Hello and welcome to Development Futures, a podcast brought to you by the Indo-Pacific Development Centre here at the Lowy Institute. My name is Grace Stanhope, Research Associate in the Centre, and I'm your host for this episode. In this podcast, our researchers and some of the world's leading experts discuss fresh policy insights and ideas on the most pressing development issues in the world today. The United Nations system is facing its most serious legitimacy and financing crisis in decades. Budgets are stretched, mandates have multiplied, and contributions from major donors are going down. At the same time, geopolitical tensions are reshaping power dynamics inside the organisation. Today, we're joined by Ryan Neelam, a former Australian diplomat and the Director of Public Opinion and Foreign Policy here at the Lowy Institute, and Ronny Patz, author of the book Managing Money and Discord in the UN, to unpack how we got here, where the reform process stands, and what the UN might look like a decade from now. Welcome, Ryan. Welcome, Ronny.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Thanks for having me.
Ryan, we'll start with you. You served as an Australian diplomat in a previous life to the United Nations in New York. Can you start by addressing some of the crises in the United Nations? There's a crisis of relevance, of legitimacy, of confidence. Can you talk us through, is the UN fit for purpose 80 years on?
Well, look, the short answer, Grace, is no, it's not fit for purpose. The UN, as you know, was formed 80 years ago in the embers of World War II, and the power structures that were set up then very much reflected the world as it was 80 years ago. Now, since then, of course, the world has changed completely. We've seen the rise of China. We've seen growing geopolitical tensions, particularly more recently between China and the United States. Russia is trying to reassert itself. We have the developing world and a lot of emerging economies rising in terms of their economic status and in terms of their political clout, and different expectations upon the institution than what was placed upon it at the end of World War II. So there's a lot of change, and there's a lot of and the challenges that face the United Nations today are again different from what we saw at the end of World War II. But some of them are the same, and I think that if we go back to the core mandates of the UN to prevent war and to maintain international peace and stability, to uphold human rights and dignity, and to progress development and economic well-being across the world. If you look at those three things, you'd have to say that the UN is struggling on all of those fronts. So on peace and security, look at the most visible conflicts of Ukraine and Gaza, and the Security Council has failed to act. And we know why. That's because of the veto, of course. That's a longer conversation, perhaps for another time. But that's what people see, whether the UN is doing a lot in other areas, and I'll come to that. On human rights, the UN does provide some measure of transparency, and it tries to hold actors accountable for human rights abuses, but it constantly rubs up against member states' sovereignty. And we see countries like China and Russia trying to revise the way those the Declaration of Human Rights tried to embed this idea of universality across the system. China is putting forward a very different vision where it tries to say that respect for different cultures and political systems is essentially a tool to de-emphasize the universality of human rights. And then when we come to development and sustainable development in particular, I think the most recent assessment said that the SDGs are well off track. That's the Sustainable Development Goals. And we see countries, particularly donor countries across the world, pulling back on their aid commitments. Now, having said all of that, there's still a lot that the UN does and a lot that people should be aware of, because there's no other organisation or individual state that would fulfil these functions if the UN were to cease to exist. And I'm talking about functions like peacekeeping, where there are 70,000 people deployed across 11 peacekeeping operations around the world, from South Sudan to Lebanon, to a range of other countries. And those peacekeeping missions are keeping people safe. They're preventing conflicts from flaring up again. Humanitarian assistance around the world, around 1 in every 5 children, or about 400 million children are living or fleeing conflict zones. And the UN is there providing vaccinations, education, healthcare. Say each year the UN saves 350 million children from malnutrition. So these are not trivial numbers or trivial things that the UN does, but often the focus falls on where it's failing. And that's rightly so. We should be looking at where we can make the UN better. And I'll just finish on this point. I think when you look at the failings of the UN, a lot of it is to do often with the failure of member states to agree or compromise to form political agreements. And that was a lot easier 10 years ago when I was at the UN, when we agreed the Sustainable Development Goals. The Paris Agreement was agreed as well on climate change. There was a sense then that countries were willing to compromise on what they wanted in order to achieve a greater good. We don't see that willingness there today. So the political environment that we are operating in now is much more fractured, much more divided, and forming these big agreements on meeting global problems or taking care of the global commons is much more difficult.
That's a really good overview, I think, and a good reminder to think about the United Nations as something that it's the member states, like it is the sum of the parts. It's not just this sort of standalone organization that we think about having failures. It's behalf of all of the member states. Ronny, you have dived very, very deep into the financial data of the UN. There's a whole range of pressures on the budgets, from operational costs to late member payments to this kind of mission creep or this expansion of mandates. That's even before the Trump administration's decision to withdraw its contributions. How serious is the funding crisis, and what impacts are you seeing or have you already seen?
I think we are in the deepest financial crisis the UN system and the UN core have been seeing in decades, if not ever. And I say this because the Secretary General of the United Nations a few weeks ago said in a meeting of the UN General Assembly Budget Committee that the UN is facing bankruptcy in 2026 unless member states act on the finances of the organization. But I also say this because not just this core UN budget is under threat, because mainly the US has and is withholding its contributions to this budget, but also because the rest of the UN system, the UN Refugee Agency, the World Food Programme, the International Organization for Migration and others have seen massive cuts this year, to the degree that we are seeing cuts down to 30, sometimes 40% compared from 2024 in the system, which means thousands and thousands of UN staff have already been let go or not rehired. And I don't think there has been a time in the UN system where such a crunch has happened in such a short time, and without a political agreement among member states, what Ryan just said, where this system should go as it is cut down, as it needs reprioritization, as it needs a new idea of where it's going. So we are really in a deep, deep crisis.
It's a pretty sobering picture, I suppose, hearing from Ryan all of the work that is on, or the burden that is on the shoulders of the UN, and then hearing that they're running on a, what do you call it? Running on an oily rag or something?
Smell of an oily rag.
Yes.
Smell of an oily rag, that's a saying.
And I mean, we can talk about this crisis, as a crisis of the organizations, right? But what Ryan just said is that a lot of this money is humanitarian aid that's not been spent. So 10 staff cuts on the UN side means less food delivered, less development aid provided. And the peacekeeping missions are facing a 25% personnel cut very soon, just because there is no money available. And so this means that the services the UN system provides to its member states are just declining to a degree that actually matters on the ground.
Yeah, and there's a human cost to all of that.
Absolutely. We're also seeing, I guess, a shift in who makes up that kind of contributor base, if you like. China's contribution to the core UN budget has grown from below 5% in 2010 to around 20% today, while the traditional donors like the US and the United Kingdom have been cutting back. There's some concern from Western governments, and has been for quite some time, about the rising influence of China within the UN and other international organisations. Ronny, what does that mean for how the UN functions and makes decisions?
Well, China has risen from 5% of the core budget share 15, 20 years ago to now 20%. And to compare this, the ceiling for core contributions to the UN budget is 22%. That's what the US is expected to pay. This means that China is expecting to have much more of a say of how this money is spent in the core UN system. It also meant that in a year where the US is not paying its contributions, China has also been using its larger contributions to hold the organization at a much tighter grip. It only paid the last 200 or $192 million of its contribution out of around 700 million US dollars now late in October, meaning that the cash flow situation of the organization was crippled even more than it would have been if there was only the withholding of contributions from the US. So on this side, China seems to be using its financial power to hold the organization on a shorter leash. On the other hand, the majority of the UN system is financed from voluntary contributions. So earmarked projects that are spent on development, on humanitarian aid. And China has not been contributing to this part of the core financing of the wider system until now. And I'm not seeing that it's actually stepping in. So it is becoming a major core funder, but it's not behaving like the other major funders, the US, Germany. The EU is paying voluntarily more. The EU as an institutional setup is paying more voluntarily than China pays in obligatory funding. And so it's really interesting that China probably seems to prefer bilateral support on multilateral development while using the core funding to hold the institutional setup more under control.
That's a really interesting distinction between the voluntary and the core contributions. And it also, I think, speaks to how those member states see the organization, or how they see their role within it and how they can exert influence over it, I suppose. And in that vein, Ryan, there is concern from other governments, I suppose not the US, about rising Chinese influence in the UN, because they're the ones stepping back. But for middle powers like Australia, Japan, the Europeans, and it's I guess a complex question, because of course the UN is inherently geopolitical, will always be geopolitical. But is this a kind of watershed moment for global leadership, seeing this transition as the US pulls back and China kind of pushes forward?
Well, I think the first thing I'd say is that Chinese leadership in the UN isn't a given. It isn't automatic just because the US is pulling back. Clearly what Trump is doing is an abdication of global leadership when it comes to America's role in institutions like the UN. But China is not necessarily filling that gap in all cases. It's trying in some places, and others it's not actually leaning in that much. Take climate change, for example. The UN COP is on in Belém in Brazil at the moment, and there's been a lot of coverage about this disjunct between China actually doing a lot on the renewable energy transition at home. It's the world's leading producer of renewable technology. It's doing more than any other country to deploy clean energy technology. But when it comes to its contribution, its commitments at the UN, many have called those underwhelming, because China doesn't like to be held down by commitments in a multilateral context. It likes to do what it sees as in its interests, but not cede necessarily its political space to other institutions. So China, as you and others have pointed out, it's not the same kind of actor as what the US used to be, and it's not necessarily trying to do that. It is trying to revise the rules and its image, and that in some cases is a concern for like-minded Western countries, Australia, Canada, Europe, where Australia has always been a big supporter of the idea that there are universal human rights and that countries should do their utmost to protect civilians and uphold human dignity. When you see efforts to undermine those concepts there's I think a strong sense of concern amongst other countries that could ultimately impact on our interests in our region and at home. The other aspect I'd say is interesting is when you have this vacuum of leadership. In some cases, when you've got these big budget gaps opening up, Ronnie pointed out the potential 25% cut to boots on the ground in peacekeeping operations. These expressions of concern from Western countries, I think they're well-meaning and they're appropriate, but that only takes you so far. And what I don't see is many countries really grappling with how do we deal with the stark choices that leave us with. I mean, when it comes to the protection of civilians, humanitarian assistance, the vulnerable populations that the UN is responsible for delivering services to across the globe, there's not that much that you hear right now about countries saying, okay, we're going to step up and try and fill that gap. And in some cases, that's understandable. In some respects, it's understandable when you look at the war in Ukraine. Europe's pivoting a lot of its budgets towards focusing on defence in that context. But at the same time, we talked about the human cost of that, and there's simply going to be some very difficult choices that the UN has to make as these funding levels drop.
The UN 80 Action Plan was recently released to member states. That was last week, I think. And that seeks to reform the UN mandate and the organisational structure, and it gives a December 2026 deadline for the work to be completed. Sticking with you, Ryan, do you think the plan as it's currently set out will actually meaningfully increase efficiency and reduce fragmentation at the UN? And do you think the end result will be something that Secretary General Guterres is proud of as his legacy?
I think I'll have to leave that one to the history books to determine whether he is proud of it. But in terms of whether there are efficiencies to be gained, I think there definitely are. I mean, everybody acknowledges that the UN itself is a lumbering bureaucracy, that there are lots of overlapping mandates, a lot of duplication, silos, inefficiencies in how it deals with hires staff and how it deals with appointments. So there's a lot that can be done. I think there's opportunities in the crisis to be grasped there, but at the same time, we've seen many criticise the UN 80 initiative for rather than being a reform plan, being a cost-cutting exercise. And it's essentially it is a response to the US and Trump's approach to the UN. I think it's been catalysed and prompted by some of those major changes, and Guterres is essentially trying to get out in front of that. But I think there are fair criticisms about the fact that many of these measures are being brought in on a short timeline, perhaps understandably, but as sort of blunt instruments. There was a memo that was leaked earlier in the year that sort of asked all of the heads of agencies and UN bodies to offer up, like Ronnie will know the figure, but it was something like 20% cuts in budget and staff. And, that doesn't seem to be a very sensitive or strategic way to deal with a funding crisis. Sure, you have to act, and sure, you have to act quickly, but there should be some sense that, there's a prioritisation between the functions. And I would think that, those critical life-saving service delivery functions rise to the top, and you try and protect those a bit more. And maybe, at least in the short term, some of the mandates or some of the work that it's doing on the normative setting functions, as important as they are and as much as I believe in them, maybe they take a back seat while you try and rebuild and reform the UN to work more efficiently.
Ronnie, I suppose if we take the December 2026 deadline and we hope that the reform or the cost-cutting exercise, if you like, is finalised by then, what do you see the budget likely to look like at the end of 2026? Staffing levels, impact on operations. I know there's been a lot of talk about merging of some of the major agencies, any new revenue sources, and what are the reactions of any particular member states?
Well, I think in the course of the end of this year, 2025, and next year, we will only first start to see the cuts that have already happened and a lot of the reform, so-called reform that we are seeing is actually just formalizing the de facto cuts that have already happened, which means that there is not a lot of street strategizing in some of the reform process going on, but basically the UN Secretariat right now in New York, Geneva, and elsewhere is already operating on a so-called vacancy rate. So budgeted posts that are not filled with personnel that is approaching 20%. And some of those budget cuts are actually just a formalization of that reality. So what we're going to see next year is whether member states come together and go beyond this, let's say, cutting by vacancy to moving to a reprioritization exercise that Ryan just mentioned. And this is where the difficulty of the current geopolitical setup comes into play, because what is the core function of the UN system is very much a disagreement between the global north, the global south, between the big powers. And so what we are seeing as a kind of muddling through reform process right now is actually a response of the Secretary General, of the leaderships of the different UN agencies, to a lack of guidance and priorities from member states. They're trying to cut the corners where it's possible without, let's say, creating much political upheaval. But in reality, we are going to see a UN system that reprioritizes by projectized cuts, meaning that member states that are not paying voluntary contributions this year, next year, they decide basically where the UN system shrinks. In New York and Geneva, the cuts are happening by the fact when contracts are ending and vacancies actually come into place. This is the position that are not going to be filled. And I think it will take until the middle of next year to even realize where this has happened and where not. So to answer your question more clearly, I don't think the reform process and the reprioritization process will be finished by the end of 2026. Maybe we're getting to, let's say, 5% efficiency gains or so, but not a process that matches the 25, 30, 40% budget cuts that some of those agencies have seen. And I really believe that it will take until the next Secretary General is selected by the end of next year, that maybe a new and final push to, a more political, geopolitical, so to say, reform process might start.
Staying on those reforms, Ryan, and picking up on something Ronny just said, one of the major calls for reform for many, many years has been around the representation of developing countries, the global south, the majority world, often called the G77 at the UN. What has been the role of the global south in shaping this reform process that's happening right now? And do you think the result of this reform process could be a real power shift that they're looking for, or will it be a bit of symbolism?
Look, I think there's a couple of aspects to this. One is there's the institutional reform agenda, and if you like, that's about the prioritization, the efficiencies in the Secretariat or the UN bureaucracy, if you like. And I think there's an opportunity there to do things smarter, to do things leaner. But as Ronny, I think, very rightly pointed out, the Secretariat often feels captive to member states who see things in very different ways. Basically, since the UN was founded, there's been a discussion about how to reform the Security Council so it's more reflective of the world as it evolves. And Australia and other countries have long supported the idea that you expand the Council's membership to be more reflective of the world today. That would mean seeing a permanent member from Africa, a permanent member from Latin America, perhaps Japan, India as well. Australia's been very supportive of those ideas that, you sort of expand the permanent membership, but without giving them the veto, because I think that would be, we've seen the veto has been a constant roadblock in the way of agreement in the Security Council, and then that reflects badly on the organisation as a whole. So that's one thing. The other aspect is in terms of the senior appointments of the UN. There's always tussles for who gets which top post. And the UN for a long time has operated sort of in a very untransparent way in how it appoints these senior positions. The head of the IMF is always a European, the head of the World Bank is always an American, the head of the Department of Economic and Social Affairs is always a Chinese national. Countries really hold on to those things. If we're throwing open the conversation about UN reform and how it could work better, then one aspect of that should be how can it get the best talent for the best jobs, and not simply have these backroom deals that were put in place a long time ago on certain countries getting certain posts. And that may mean you have more representation from different parts of the world rather than sort of a few powerful countries holding key positions across the system.
Final one for you both, and this will be really easy. If you were in charge, so say you're advising Guterres or say you are elected as the next Secretary General at the end of next year, how would you ensure the UN remains relevant and functional for the next decade, if you like, or the next 80 years, if you like? But what are the core things you're holding on to? Where are you letting go? What do you see the future looking like? Maybe we'll start with Ronny.
Well, if I were to advise the Secretary General, which I'm not sure I'm going to do, is to start a reform process that actually brings together well-meaning leaders of the world that like and want the UN to function, even if they disagree on what the most important parts are, but that those that who really want this multilateral structure to work, to come together and to think about not just the core UN in New York and Geneva, but to think about the entire UN system, from the World Health Organization to the World Food Program, from peacekeeping to refugee agency work, and think, what is the core structure that really needs to be supported by everyone? How do these parts interact in crisis situations and in, let's say, more quiet years? And how to balance the core funding and the voluntary funding, how to coordinate the donors' interests with the global majority, the global South that holds 2/3 of the votes in the General Assembly better. And this is not going to happen by pure bureaucratic processes. This needs foreign ministers or even higher. And this is really hard. But I think the UN at 80 has come to a point where re-evaluating these structures is really necessary. And this is not going to be done by working level diplomats in New York.
Ryan, what do you think?
Well, I'm reminded by the words of the second Secretary General of the UN, Dag Hammarskjöld, who said that the UN was not created to take humanity to heaven, but to save it from hell. And I think that still holds as we look at the UN over the next 80 years. We don't need the UN to be perfect. We need it to do better at constraining conflict, preventing human rights abuses, protecting the global commons. Those are the areas where the UN has comparative advantage from any other organisation because of its convening power. If we accept that the next few years or more is going to be a resource-constrained environment, I think the UN needs to be, much more hard-headed. The next Secretary General needs to be much more hard-headed about what it prioritises and what it doesn't, and that means not just leaving it to member states to say, everything is important, therefore nothing is, but the Secretary General needs to play a leadership role in articulating where the UN has comparative advantage in the global landscape and really leaning into those. So that would mean, in my view, it's the prioritisation of those life-saving services and mandates, and then looking at how much it can do on some of the normative work that's, the UN does well in terms of arms control, in terms of climate change, which, there'll be a lot of debate about how quickly it's moving, but it's indisputable that it's made a difference on the trajectory of temperature rise. So those are the few things that I think. And then, the last point, to come back to that idea that more transparency and accountability about what the UN does well, and communicating that message to people around the world, but also more transparency about why it's not doing well and the reasons for that. So where member states use the veto, there's been initiatives to get them to explain why they did it. And you're, hard-headed and realistic that you're not going to get rid of the veto anytime soon, but holding accountable those countries that play a spoiler role is I think, really important to the functioning of the system as a whole.
Absolutely. Thank you, Ryan and Ronny, for joining me today.
Pleasure.
Thank you for having me.
You've been listening to Development Futures, a podcast from the Indo-Pacific Development Centre at the Lowy Institute. Hosted by Institute experts, produced by Josh Godding, and supported by the Australian Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. Development Futures is part of the Lowy Institute podcast network. Find all of our podcast series on our website, loweyinstitute.org. Thanks for listening.